Hello and welcome to the Antique Wireless Association and our year 2020 annual convention. A little bit different format than we're used to from previous years, but nonetheless the AWA is pleased to bring you the convention this year, although certainly in a little bit different format. So we have many presentations for you this year via the YouTube, so let's get right at our next one. The theme of the convention this year is amateur radio, and it's my pleasure to talk about the novice class license. Starting in about 1951, it was a very interesting period of time and had a lot to do with the generation and improvement and continuation of the amateur radio licensing. I'm Ed Gable, K2MP, and I'm also was WN2MPM, so I speak of a lot of experience in the going back to the novice days. So let's get right at the program here. First, we're going to talk about a little bit of what was happening to amateur radio back at the end of World War II. There was a tremendous growth in licensing after World War II because of the fact we had a tremendous amount of very well trained, very skilled, very competent radio men coming out of the armed forces at the end of the war. These people knew code, they knew enough about radio operating and theory to learn a little bit more and pass the amateur radio theory test. So they came out literally prepared. One of the problems is the growth after that period. The growth of the amateur radio licensing started to level off. So in the late 1940s, 48, 49, after the burst of World War II radio men, amateur radio was a little bit of a doldrums, shall we say. And let's look at that a little bit, and we'll find out why people thought it was necessary to bring out a new entry-level license. So let's look here at what the amateur allocation looked like in 1949. First of all, there were only two modes of operation to speak of, and that was phone and CW. And phone, of course, was AM, amplitude modulation. There was no sideband. There was terribly small amount of FM as a experimental basis. And we also had only a few amateur bands and only two licenses. Class A and Class B. Class A was a little bit more difficult testing. Class B lesser so, and Class A therefore had more privileges. Class B had fewer. So let's look at the bands and privileges here. ADCW was the lowest frequency band. There was no 160 meter band in 1949. So ADCW had Class A and Class B operators could operate on ADCW. 75 phone, however, was Class A only. And that started some of the little rivalry between Class A and Class B operators, and it wasn't good. In fact, there was one local chap here near the Rochester area used to get on and call CQ75, Class A operators only. No lids, no kids, no space cadets. This is W2OY. So that didn't go over very well with some of the Class B operators. 40 CW was kind of interesting band, and a lot of people didn't realize that 40 at that time was CW only. There was no phone allowed on 40. So you could operate 40 CW as a Class A or Class B operator. 20 meters CW was Class A and B as well. 20 meter phone, however, was Class A only. So another kind of a big division there between Class A and Class B operators, because the two very most popular phone bands, 75 and 20, were Class A only. There was an 11 meter band, 11 and 10 meters, and when the band was open, when we had sunspots, Class A and Class B operators could operate CW and phone in portions of 11 and 10 meters. Just a quick look at VHF, UHF bands. There is the usual, what we think of today, 6.2, 220, 432, 1296. And then if you could make something work there, the super high frequency bands were 2300 to 21,000 megahertz. If you can make something work there, it's all yours. Have at it. There was also something called conditional class of license, but that was really the same as Class B, only taken by a volunteer examiner. So that's what the amateur bands looked like at the end of 1949, 1950 time period. Here's a very typical amateur radio station of the period. I say very typical in two major categories, and that is the transmitter was typically homebrew and the receiver was typically manufactured. And the reason for that is actually you didn't have a choice. There were no or very few commercially available amateur radio transmitters. People just built their own due to lack of availability. And after the war, World War II surplus equipment was quite very available, actually. You could buy an Arc 5 rig for, in the $5 range, brand new in a box, unused, from military surplus. So there's a lot of transmitters available through the military. But that was very typical. Homebrew or military surplus, but always a manufactured receiver. So here's the big announcement. July 1st, 1951, the Federal Communications Commission announced that they were going to eliminate Class A and Class B licensing, and they would add new licenses of the novice, technician, and general class. So that was July 1st, 1951. Obviously, the loss of Class A and B was something very much to the heart of the old-timers at the time. But it was a good way to add new amateurs to our ranks. And we'll find out in just a minute here some of the privileges and why. It was interesting to note that the insert you see on the screen was found in the 1951 Arrl license manual. So the Arrl that year got caught a little bit, and they had a license manual that did not have the new license classes. So in 1951, you found two license class manuals. The one in the forefront is the one with novice and technician classes, already to study and learn how to become an amateur. And the one in the back, the first one of the year, without the novice and technician licensing information. And of course we had the 50-cent price, which is something you didn't see very often. Okay, let's look at the 1951 novice class license structure. And the biggest change, the newest concept, is the fact you had a license that was 1 year. It was non-renewable. It was one time only. So once you had your novice license, At the end of the year, if you didn't upgrade to general or technician, that was it. You were no longer a licensed radio amateur. You were off the air. And that was very much by design. The whole idea was to have a class of license that would easily bring new people into the ranks and get them on the air and get their amateur radio career started. So 1 year, non-renewable, one time only. It was a simple written test on theory and regulations. There was a code test of 5 words a minute, and of course that was required by international licensing, international requirements. The code test was plain text, 1 minute, and included both receiving and sending. The tests were by the FCC or mail. However, if you lived more than 75 miles away from an FCC examination point, you could take the test with a volunteer examiner. Now the privileges. 80 and 11 meters CW. That's it. Your HF privileges were 80 and 11 meters CW. On 2 meters, however, you did have a segment for phone and CW on the 2 meter band. 75 watt power input, crystal controlled, no VFO allowed. That took some special operating techniques we'll talk about here in a minute. There were special call signs with an N in the prefix of the call. So there were 2 by 3 call signs. My call was WN2 MPM. And after I upgraded to general, as all novices did, you would just drop the N from your call. So WN2 MPM became W2 MPM when you upgraded. So those were the privileges as first started out in July 1st, 1951. Take a look at the written test here. There were 20 questions on the test, but there are only 28 questions in the entire novice pool. So if you had the license manual, you could look at the 28 questions and pretty easily kind of understand what you were going to find on the test. It was designed to be easy, not difficult to enter. And there were the important things you needed to know. How much power could you run? What frequencies were you allowed to operate on, etc., etc. Unlike today, the test was similar, but not exact. So in other words, you read the license manual, and they would show you questions that were similar to what you would find on the test, but not exact by any means. Here's a typical license. Looked like every other license except the call sign again. KN9BCX belonging to John Morgan. The N, of course, depicted that it was a novice. And, of course, the class, as all licenses, is shown below as novice. However, the C meant that that person took their test via a volunteer examiner. Here's a typical novice station of the period. So let's take a look at some of the what you would find here. Number one, of course, you have a transmitter. Here is shown a Heathkit AT1, and that was a fine entry-level transmitter, a single 6AG7 to a 6L6, ran about 20 watts. Crystal controlled, of course, and there's the crystal shown on the front of the panel. You could plug it in easily in order to change frequencies. Below that is a Hammerlin HQ129X, nice entry-level receiver. Cost about $179, I think, at that time, as I recall. And of course, you had a logbook. and you had to have a key. Not shown here very well in the photograph is the fact that, and a lot of you are recognizing that, even though it's not a good photograph, and that's a military surplus J38 key. Everybody had a J38 key. They were available all over the place as military surplus because they were cheap. Not cheap in the fact that they were well designed, well built, a very serviceable key, but they were cheap. I bought mine for 69 cents from Bursting Appleby Company, an early mail order radio parts company. A lot of you will recognize that. So there's what you had to have. And now what did you do? Let's talk a little bit about the operating habits. Again, you're crystal controlled. So you just stayed where you were for that period of time you were operating, or for that QSO, etc. The crystal, as you can see from the picture of the crystal there, had the frequency right on it. So this novice on the 40-meter band, he was stuck at 7083. So let's say he wanted to make a QSO. He'd sit down and fire up his equipment, get it ready, and call CQ. So very typical, CQ, 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 this is WN2, etc., and send K. And now, much unlike today's operating, where you have typically everybody's using a transceiver nowadays, instead of sending K and go ahead and listening on your frequency, this novice operator had to start tuning, because the likelihood of the calling station returning right on frequency was pretty slim. So he started tuning maybe up 5 kc, then down 5 kc, down 5 more, maybe up 10. In other words, he had a technique, listening and listening and listening for people to call you. And once you found somebody up or down 5, 10, 15 kc, then you would leave the receiver there and start your QSO. In a similar fashion, when you were answering a CQ, you would hear this person calling, CQ, CQ, this is, K, go ahead, and then you would start calling him. WN2 MPM, WN2 MPM, you would repeat it very often. Remember, you're the calling station. It was your job to make sure that the operator found you somewhere in the band. So you called him a lot. You made it very clear. You made his call very clear over the air, and then your call was just a couple times, three times. But it was your job. It was kind of interesting concept. It was your job to make yourself heard somewhere in the novice band. So a much different operating technique from what people are used to today. The logbook was kind of interesting. This is my log from, let's look at June 30, 1957. On that day, I turned on my radio, I pressed the key, made sure everything was all right, and you logged it. You transmitted on the air. You logged that. And then you called CQ. No contact. There's a lot of no contact in the log. But you logged that. You logged the fact you called CQ with no contact. And then the usual stuff you find. You work somebody, you put down the frequencies and call signs and signal reports, name, QTH. So everybody kept a logbook. I filled 7, maybe 8 logbooks. Really enjoyed that, and I still have them. I don't know any novice that didn't keep their logbook, unless they lost it during moves or something. But nah, people just kept their logs. This is a photo that shows something else regarding our little, I'll call it part of operating techniques. But look at the wall. the wall is just covered with QSL cards. Something that, again, people just don't seem to do that anymore nowadays. But back in the novice days, boy, you did that. You put QSL cards all over the wall. That studious young novice operator is me. There's my station in the background, a Globe Chief 90 and a National NC 120, RAO 2 surplus, I think it was. And I'm building something. Very early learned to be interested in home brewing. And that black blob on the floor behind me, that's Henry. I don't know, there's something about your childhood dog. There'll never ever be another one. No matter how many dogs you might own, there'll never be another first childhood dog. Henry just adored me. I don't know why. If I got up out of that chair, he'd jump off the floor, and he's right behind me. He'd say, "Ooh, what do you want? Where are you going? What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he'd follow me everywhere. Good old Henry. A little off topic here. QSL cards, again, one of the reasons that QSLing was so popular is the fact that cards are so darn cheap, as was the postage. Here are typical cards you could have printed from World Radio Labs, a maker of fine amateur radio transmitting equipment, and had a large catalog of radio products and what have you. So these cards were 100 cards for $3.49. The only thing you could tell them is your name, address, call sign, and color, and where your QTH was. And a week later, you had 100 cards in the mail. Here's another group of cards. The one on the top right is by the General Electric Company, and those cards were free. Not printed. You had to take the blank cards. They printed everything in blue and light blue, and the call, the logbook data there. So you just got the cards for free, and then you'd had to have your call sign and your name and address printed. But that was pretty good. And notice the WN3J there. It's pretty common to not print the N. So if you figured, hey, I'm going to upgrade pretty quick. Yeah, I know the code pretty well. I can get to 13 words a minute pretty fast, so I can upgrade to General. So I'm not going to print the N. Otherwise, I'll have a lot of cards left over. So that's exactly what Jim Mullen did. He just printed W3JQT, and then he wrote in the N when he was operating as a novice. The other card on the left, KN8, that was from the Walter Ash Company. I think they beat the price. They had $2.50 for 100 cards printed. So that was also a pretty good deal. And even though it was directed toward the novice class, a lot of generals and higher class people, they bought the same cards. So there were a ton of those. And if you look at pictures of Radio Shacks of the era, you'll find a whole ton of those Walter Ash cards on the wall, with the only difference being the call sign. So let's look at some of the progression, if you will, of the novice class during this period. I typically don't like slides like this with just a bunch of data, but how else do you present just a bunch of data? So here we go. 1952, very close to the entry of novice classes. The 15-meter band was open. And that wasn't just novices. It was open as an amateur radio band to all operators. So that was a big deal. Novices got a good band that they could operate some good DX on. Didn't have to worry necessarily about the propagation variations at 10 meters. And again, very shortly afterwards, novices got 40 meters CW. That was a big deal. 80 meters being one of the easiest bands to get on, easy wire antennas and what have you, was really, really crowded. So getting 40 meters to share that easy to get on band, again, some simple transmitters, not hard to build, not a lot of straight capacitance. You could just wire almost anything and it would work on 40. So getting 40 meters was another big deal. 1953, the FCC ran out of W calls, and they started issuing K, such as KN2 EAW would then become K2 EAW, KN2K, K2K, etc. In 1954, you see these changes are coming up pretty quick. The novice and technician class testing became only available via volunteer examiners with the testing coming through the mail. So the FCC dropped testing novices. And I'm thinking that's probably because they had really, really good luck with it. They probably detected very little cheating, very little something going on here with all these volunteer examiners. It just worked. And I'm sure the FCC was very happy to get rid of novice testing at their exam stations. Probably had enough to do. 1956, the FCC reissues expired W2 call signs. So that's how I got WN2 MPM. They just went through and said, forget all these sequences. Just look at any W2 that's not issued right now and issue it again. So that's again how I got WN2 MPM in 1956. 1958 saw something that we're all kind of aware of, I guess, and that was the loss of the 11 meter band to the Class D citizen band. And 27 megahertz never sounded the same. In 1958, the FCC once again played with call signs a little bit and started issuing Whiskey Victor 2 call signs. WV2s, you couldn't just drop the V, otherwise you'd be jumping into call signs and other classes. So Whiskey Victor 2 call signs as a novice changed to WA2 calls when upgrading. So that's the whole beginning of the WA2, WB2 call sign sequence. Continuing on with novice era licensing changes, in 1972, novices were allowed VFOs. Oh boy, what a difference that was. So you could no longer had to be crystal controlled on your transmitter, and then that also obviously would allow novices to use transceivers, and that was becoming a little bit of an issue. So many new radios on the market were transceivers, and novices could not use those. I have a very interesting, on the side here, a very interesting little accessory for one of my transceivers. It's a novice crystal control kit for a Collins S-line. It's kind of valuable. It's a very unusual accessory for a Collins. If you were a novice and you could afford a Collins S-line, okay, you just couldn't use it because it wasn't crystal controlled. And here's this little module that you could buy from Collins, stick it inside, and a little switch, VFO crystal, and 4 crystal sockets, and you could run your Collins S-line on novice CW. Next, all WN2K and 2 calls were eliminated, and new call signs were Kilo Alpha 2. and then number and suffix. In 1977, technician class were given novice privileges, and I think that recognizes the fact that maybe the technician class wasn't working as well as the novice class for entry-level people. It was thought that the technician class people wanted to become amateurs. They weren't necessarily endeared with this CW operation, but they liked the technical aspect of it. But that wasn't working as well, so they were given novice privileges, hoping that they would learn CW and move up to general class and more mainstream ham radio activity. 1977, novice band segments allowed 250 watts, and 1978, the novice class became 5 years and renewable. So that was a big deal. Maybe it wasn't geared exactly toward the purpose of the novice license, where it would get new people in and on the air very easily. But there was other things going on. So yeah, 5-year renewable being more mainstream and more like the other licenses worked at that time. Instant upgrading and was available or started in 1978. Not any effect at all on novice operating or operating privileges, but just a convenient way to get licensing processed. And in 1987, kind of a big deal, when the band was open, novices get 10-meter sideband privileges. So they now have some real HF voice privileges instead of 2-meter only. So it seems to be working. In 1956, we went from pre-novice days of just very little growth to over 10,000 new amateurs per year. So that's a huge change. There then, or now, in 1956, 140,000 licensed radio amateurs in the U.S., and novices were fully accepted into the ham ranks. There was none of this rivalry with Class A and Class B and all this type of stuff. They were really ham radio operators. As a new novice, I never, ever felt like I wasn't part of the ham radio ranks. You were just welcome with open arms. There was a lot of help, a lot of Elmers. And one of the things that we kind of hoped would happen on the point of the manufacturers is now the manufacturers had lots and lots of marketing for new equipment. So let's look at that for a little bit. So we'll look at a few advertising. Here's Amico. They really were geared toward the entry-level amateurs, including in the upper right hand of the printout there. Was an Amico transmitter for $16.95. Single 6V6 crystal oscillator. Said it ran about 15 watts input. Oh, that would never click. So it was, but yeah, hey, for $16 you could get on the air. It's kind of interesting today. That transmitter, the Amico AC1, is a real collectible. People are looking for those all over the place. In fact, so collectible, there's a company who, aftermarket now, is selling the AC1 all over again. It cost a lot more than $16 today, but kind of interesting. Below, the Conrad monitor. What the heck is a Conrad monitor? Well, this is 1957. We're at the peak of the Cold War. And the people who worried about that type of thing, they're saying, boy, you know, we could have these Ruski, we'll call the Ruski bombers flying over to the U.S., and they could follow broadcast stations, and if they could find WHAM on 1180, there they are. Let's beam in on that, and they could fly right over Rochester, New York, and drop a bomb. Well, the powers that be said, well, yeah, but boy, they could probably follow amateur radio station signals as well. So let's listen for WN2MPM. He's in Hilton. That's outside of Rochester. We'll follow his signal in and drop a bomb right on top of WN2MPM. Well, in order to prevent that from happening, we had a bunch of radar sites, and they said, here come the Ruskies. Let's turn off all radio transmitters. And yes, that included amateur radio transmitters. So in 1957, you had to have in your AM radio station a Conrad monitor. And if the station you were monitoring went off the air, a little red light on the front panel went off, and some were even hooked up with relays right to the primary power of your transmitter. And if WHAM commercial radio went off the air, boom, your transmitter went off the air. So kind of a little interesting sidelight. On the left is the E.F. Johnson Company, huge manufacturer of very good, very high quality amateur radio equipment. And what did they do? Absolutely, like everybody else, right on top, they brought out the Viking Adventure CW transmitter and sold a bunch of them. $54.95 for a 50-watt band switched transmitter. Take it out of the box, make it work. On the right is kind of an interesting company. The Instructograph Company had been around, way back in the telegraph days, turn of the century. Oh, oops, got to be careful. 1900. They were around teaching people how to run, how to copy, send and copy radio telegraph. And they came back. They made it back for a little while into the amateur radio field. National Radio Company, of course, was big prior to the war, but they made a big effort. Their entry-level receiver, the SW-54, wasn't exactly a big hit. That's because everybody in the world had electrical band spread, but not the SW-54. It had a big 6-inch plastic dial with a little edge sticking out, and you would put your thumb on that and move it very slowly up and down so you could tune the bands after your novice EQ. Not so good. WRL, we already talked about them a little bit. Really had a wonderful line of early transmitters for the new amateurs. The one on top there, the Globe Chief Model 90, is one I had. Actually, I still have it. It's in the box. It's in the basement. I still have it. Oh my gosh, I've been licensed for 62 years, and I still have that transmitter in a box in the basement. Someday, we'll make that, play again. And they had a complete line of accessories for that, modulators, VFOs, etc. So they'd get you when you started, and then when you upgraded and needed a modulator, needed VFOs, they'd sell you some more. In the upper left is Heathkit, of course. Heathkit Company was saved by the influx of new hams. They were kind of foundering a little bit. They didn't quite know where they wanted to go after their oscilloscope kits and some signal generators and circuit tracers, and let's see, I think they were up to model V7 on their vacuum tube voltmeters. Is there anybody who has never owned a Heathkit vacuum tube voltmeter? So yeah, they were looking around, and along came the novice license, and Heathkit continued. On the right-hand side, we see Hallicrafters. They were dominant in the field before I'm sorry. Well, yeah, before World War II, and certainly before novices, and they continued that afterwards. And let's look at that in a little more detail. So I took some QSL cards out of the Antique Wireless Museum stock, if you will. 110 QSL cards, novice QSL cards from 1952. And we kind of looked at it and said, what kind of transmitters were people using at the start of the novice class? And of those 110 cards, 75 were running homebrew. And that's exactly what we would have predicted. There were 8 Harvey Wells TBS 50. Harvey Wells was a good pre-war company. Eldeco TR-75, again, there were 7 of those. Arc 5 militaries, not unexpected, 7 of those. And 3 Lyscos, and of course, a name you very rarely hear mentioned on ham radio nowadays is a Latine entering at 2. Same thing with receivers, 110 cards, 1952, novice cards. What receiver were they using? Helicopters S40, 20 of them. Helicopters S38, 10 of them. Helicopters S76, 8. So Helicopters really was dominant. 7 came in with a Hammerlin HQ129X. Hammerlin was an excellent receiver. It was probably almost a little more than twice as expensive as the Helicopters S40. So that made an impact on Helicopters versus Hammerlin. And still military hanging in there. We had 7 BC 348s. 348s were a nice military surplus receiver. Just a few minor changes and you were ready to go. And just on the side light here, antennas, 80 and 40 meters, what we're looking at. And they're all dipoles and fed random wires. We talked about the success and the what the novice class license did, certainly for the new operators, the new licensees, and what have you. The effect it had on manufacturers and increase in business, increase in the design, manufacture, and delivery of equipment and what have you. But another thing that it had an impact on was your local amateur radio club. And I'm speaking from a lot of experience here by the Rochester Amateur Radio Association. Very quickly in the game, Rochester Amateur Radio Association, took to heart the fact that, hey, we have an opportunity here to swell the ranks of the amateur radio operator, swell the ranks of our club by helping these people get on the air. So like many amateur radio organizations, they started classes, and they started teaching the code, they started teaching theory, started teaching people how to be an operator. That was a big deal. That was a huge deal. There were so many, what can I say, not like the internet today, but a lot of help via various things that said, okay, read this book, learn this code, follow these instructions, and you'll be on the air. But nobody held their hand. Nobody said, no, that code doesn't sound quite right. Let's do it like this. Where amateur radio clubs did that very well. The Rochester Amateur Radio Association held 2 classes every year. Spring and fall amateur radio classes. And they had 50 students in every class. So they developed 100 new licensees every year. Probably more, but those are the ones that we know about. So yeah, the little shout out to the radio clubs out there who helped promote ham radio in this time period. But then what happened? Years 2000, the novice class went away. Well, first of all, there's no need for CW. Code Free took care of that. So there's no need for novice class entry level as far as the code is concerned. Novices always wanted voice privileges. They had voice privileges on 2 meters only. And then later they got 10 meters only. But I'm not sure that that satisfied the need. Text with HF is the same idea. A lot of techs joined amateur radio via the technician class. They were allowed to operate VHF and above. No technician. And then all of a sudden they got technician privileges. So did that decrease their incentive to go beyond technician? Probably to some degree, because the text, when we say text with HF privileges, they got novice HF privileges. Digital modes attracting high-tech users probably was not as big an attraction as we thought. So in 2000, there was certainly a start of digital in ham radio. Hook your computer to your transmitter, and away you go with maybe some automated CW, maybe some ASCII and what have you, but pretty limited when it started out. And I think something of interest was the Elmers. Oh God, we need Elmers. What a wonderful cadre of people helping new licensees study, get on the air, etc. But when you think about the Elmers helping novices in the year 2000, Elmers tended to be, some of the older amateurs or people coming up through the ranks. And they entered at a time when the novice class was 50 years old. It was 1951. And in 2000, the FCC figured the novice class was no longer valid. And maybe it's because everybody else who grew up through the novice class were over 50 years old. And maybe not, really as in tune to the novice class as possible. So let's look at today before we close here for the session. So today, June 5, 2020, extra class, 151,000. Advanced, you can't get an advanced class license anymore. So those are just dying off. You can renew them, but they're just going away. 38,000. General class, 179,000. Technician class, 387,000. And then let's look at the novices. There's still 7,621 of you out there. So that's interesting. And of course, that would be zero had the change not been made from 1 year not renewable. So there's still 7,000 of you maybe pounding out there, maybe with your first radio and maybe with a Qsl. Who knows? But there's still 7,000 people out there. So that's a total of 656,000. Japan is interesting, 1.3 million. They really have license structure that increases the urge for people to get a ham radio license. They've done that better than anybody, and the numbers show it. Rest of the world, 938,000, and worldwide, 2.9 of us out there, and I think going strong. So here's where I really miss the AWA convention. It was here that we expected to, turn up the lights and say, okay, all novices out there who were licensed in 1950s, stand up. And of course, the goal was to find the oldest 1950s era novice in the room during this session when we would have been face to face. So I'm really sorry that we can't do that. I think it would have been a lot of fun. So thank you for joining us here in this session. It's one of many programs set up and designed and built and put together by your museum staff and by some of the guests that you have expected to hear over the years at normal AWA convention. So it certainly has been a pleasure being with you in this kind of unique manner here tonight. But there's a lot more going on. So make sure that you look at the YouTube search engine. It's right there, right up on top. Put in search Antique Wireless Museum, and you will get a list of all of the programs that are available to you. Some are devoted to the convention. Some are there for general purpose and enjoyment of everybody. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening. It's been fun. So long, and 7-3.